Hi there, my name is Michael Darby, Technical Director with Element Materials Technology. I want to talk to you a little bit about harmonized standards with restrictions. What exactly am I talking about? Well, let's take for example the Radio Equipment Directive, and we have a list of harmonized standards. And as a manufacturer, you want to be able to apply harmonized standards so that you can demonstrate compliance with the directive, and this gives you the confidence and the legal ability to sign your declaration of conformity. So each directive has what's known as an official journal of harmonized standards, and if a standard is listed on this, it gives you what's known as presumption of conformity. So you have this document known as the official journal of harmonized standards. If a standard is appearing on this document and you fully apply it, you have presumption of conformity, which means that it's up to somebody else to prove to you that what you did wasn't okay. Whereas if there isn't a harmonized standard or you don't fully apply it, you have to kind of go the extra mile and say, well, the reason I chose this is because of that. So the background to all this being that, let's say the European Commission has said you need to assess your product for good EMC performance, good radio performance, good cybersecurity performance, things like that. How does a manufacturer even know where to begin, what process to take? There is some background information that you could look for. For example, there's a standardization request and a delegating act for these things where you could say, what exactly does the European Commission want to see with regard to radio performance? Or what exactly do they want to see with regard to cyber? So even if there is no harmonized standard at all or no published standard at all, we still know what the European Commission wants to see. But if the European Commission lists a standard on the official journal, it's like them saying, honestly, if you follow this standard and if you meet this standard and there's nothing unusual about your product, then you're good. So it's like saying this standard represents what we want to see. So let me take, for example, a very common radio standard, EN 300-328. It covers 2.4 gigahertz devices such as Bluetooth and Wi-Fi. It's a harmonized standard with no restrictions. So it's like the European Commission has said, if you apply this standard, it demonstrates compliance with the RED for this radio aspect. The power level test is fine, the emissions test is fine, the receiver blocking test is fine. We're happy with all the tests in there and we're happy with all the limits in there. So if a manufacturer fully applies that standard, they can have the confidence that they've done all the European Commission is expecting to see for the radio performance of that product. That's why they don't need to go to a notified body. They have presumption of conformity. They can sit back and say, pretty sure I've done everything I needed to. And they would use their risk assessment to determine that that was the right standard for them. Now, let's say you chose to go to a notified body anyway for a certificate then. The notified body's main role is to see, did the manufacturer do a good assessment and follow the right approach? And was their testing reasonable? Well, if the standard is harmonized, then it means the European Commission has already said we're happy that this standard is the right approach. So in that case, the notified body will go, you followed a harmonized standard. I don't need to check that the approach was okay. I just need to check that you tested correctly. Now imagine there is no harmonized standard. There's no standard at all, or there's a standard that's been published, but for some reason it's not harmonized. Let's say, for example, EN 303-687 for Wi-Fi 6E. So a standard exists, but it's not harmonized. The European Commission has the ability to accept that standard, but they've chosen not to. We could go into details on that, but my point is it's not a harmonized standard. So when you fully apply that standard, you need to go to a notified body because the standard isn't harmonized. So then the notified body's role is, have they followed the correct approach and did they test correctly? Well, when the harmonized standard was used, they didn't need to ask, have you followed the correct approach, because you'd used a harmonized standard. Whereas now you go, well, okay, I can't just blindly accept this standard. I need to know, why isn't this standard harmonized? What's wrong? what needs to be done to meet the directive. Let's say, for example, the European Commission had rejected that standard because it didn't like some of the test cases, or it didn't think the standard was acceptable. So the manufacturer and the notified body need to research those things. So the notified body's role is quite detailed if the standard isn't harmonized, because they need to figure out why isn't it harmonized, and let's fill in the gaps. So then the notified body is needed, and their review is what's wrong with this standard, what has the manufacturer done to overcome that, and did they test okay? There's this in-between ground where we see standards which get listed with a restriction. What does that mean? And is a notified body required? Well, the simple situation is most standards have a number of test cases. Let's say, for example, a standard has 12 test cases in it. Output power, bandwidth, spurious emissions, receiver blocking, timing, duty cycle, for example. So let's say you've got 12 test cases, and let's say the standard was submitted to the European Commission, and let's say they didn't like one of the test cases. Let's say they decided that the receiver performance test didn't really meet their requirements. They could have just rejected that standard, and then you'd have a non-harmonized standard. But what the Commission has been trying to do is say, we'll list it as a harmonized standard, but we'll add a restriction for the receiver part, saying this receiver test case is not harmonized. What does this mean for the manufacturer? Well, let's say, for example, you made a transmitter-only device. So it was a transmitter, so all the transmitter test cases applied to you, but the receiver clauses don't apply to you because yours is a transmitter, not a transceiver. So then you would say the test case for receiver doesn't even apply to my product. I've got a fully harmonized standard because that restriction didn't apply to me. So you could test your transmitter to that standard. You've got presumption of conformity. You don't need a notified body. Let's say you had a receiver or a transceiver though. So then that test clause does apply to you. You fully apply that standard, but you've got that non-harmonized clause. You've got that restriction. So you must go to a notified body. You can't just say to the notified body, please just review that test case, because the notified body has to review everything about that product, all radio operations. So they have to review the whole standard and any other radios in the product. But when the notified body is doing their review, remember there's those two aspects. Was the correct approach taken, and did they test correctly? Now, for all the test cases that don't have a restriction next to it, the notified body can go, the correct approach was taken, and I just need to check, did they test correctly? And so it's only for the test case that has the restriction that you would say, okay, now, what was wrong? Why was the restriction in place? And what has the manufacturer done to overcome that restriction? And so we can imagine when we have cybersecurity standards coming out, if these standards get listed on the official journal with a restriction, again, it will be a case that the clauses with no restriction are effectively a harmonized clause. And if any clauses have a restriction against them, and if that applies to a manufacturer's product, they need to go to a notified body. The notified body must review the whole standard, and then the notified body's job is just harder for the clause that has the restriction, not for the whole standard. People have asked me, is there any benefit to listing a standard with a restriction? My opinion is yes, there's a huge amount of benefit. Now, as a manufacturer, you might say, it's no benefit to me because if the standard is listed with a restriction, I have to pay a notified body for a certificate. And if the standard isn't listed at all, I still need to pay a notified body for a certificate. So it's the same cost for me. But actually, when you take cost into consideration, the true cost is your time to market. And if the notified body's job is actually much easier when you've got a standard that's listed with a restriction than if you've got a standard that's not listed at all. So the notified body's role is quicker and easier if the standard is listed with a restriction. And so that's a real benefit for the notified body, and therefore it's a benefit for the manufacturer. Hopefully that makes some sense. just thrown a load of words at you. Please reach out to me here at Element if you've got any questions or if you want to discuss this further. Like and subscribe to our channels and sign up to our newsletter for similar types of content. Thank you very much.